Today we have the great privilege of interviewing a very old family and a very old member, long-standing member of our community, Jim Foster.
And an old friend.
And if you go back far enough, we've had many years together, starting in grade 1. Jim, so we went through 12 years of high school with Jim, and we went off in our different ventures, adventures and career choices at the University of Alberta, where Jim went into law and I went into medicine. But today we're going to focus on the Foster family and their life in Red Deer, and Jim's life both in law and in politics. So, Jim, with that, Jim, would you like to tell us a bit about how your family came to Red Deer and when they came, and maybe some of the anecdotes about that?
Well, my family on my mother's side, my grandmother as a young girl came here with her 2 sisters, and my great-grandfather came to Red Deer in 1905, South Africa via England. And my grandmother met my grandfather. They were singing together in St. Luke's Anglican Church. That's how they met.
In Red Deer.
My mother was born here in 1913, I think, in a little house in North Red Deer, which incidentally is still standing, although the house I grew up in on Coronation Park is long gone and is another beautiful home. But that's on my mother's side. When I was born, our family were living in Benalto, west of Silver Lake, and we moved into Red Deer, I think January 44 or something like that. And I started school here and went through school, as you know. My father owned and operated a general store in Benalto, and then moved into Red Deer and took over the Cockshut Farm Implement dealership. And then he died a few years later, so I was raised here. My mom, as you know, had my older sister and younger sister and myself, and we've had an interesting life. It's been wonderful.
Well, would you like to tell us a bit about growing up in Red Deer and
what it
was like?
The thing you have to remember about Red Deer is that in those days, Red Deer was all in the valley, and as you know, and the Gates Avenue, one lane north and one lane south, was actually the main artery up the province. It was Highway 2, so the Edmonton Calgary traffic had to go up and down Gates Avenue. That was a big feature. We had 2 railroads in downtown, the CPR, which is, the building is still there, the old CNR on the site of the Co-op shopping center. And both these railroads had grain elevators and warehouses, so they were dominating the core of the downtown. But the downtown, unlike today, was full of car dealerships, farm implement dealerships, banks, offices, government. Basically, everybody was living in the valley.
And a few grain elevators.
And grain elevators. I had to cross the railway tracks. I lived in the Coronation Park, edge of Coronation Park. I had to cross railway tracks 4 times a day just to go to and from school.
And the pavement for lunch.
The pavement on Ross Street, going east, ended at Gates Church. So it was all gravel all the way up the hill. And an evening, especially in the fall, the downtown was quite dusty just because there weren't any paved roads to speak of. That was the only time. But Red Deer, everybody knew everybody. As young kids here, we rode our bikes all over the place. Nobody locked their houses. Nobody locked their cars. Although when I was probably 14, somebody stole my bike. But you go to school, you never put a lock on your bike. So it was a kinder, gentler, calmer time for sure.
So you would have gone through some of the old school buildings too.
Indeed.
And
the old castle down in Central Junior High area, which is gone now, and that's where everyone went. And then of course the Comp was the only high school, as you remember, and all the county kids came in there. So we had dormitories and kids from all over Central Alberta.
It was a very cosmopolitan school at that time. As I look back on it, and I'm sure you do, it was like being a university where you had students from every part of the province. But we had them here in Red Deer.
The other thing about the Comp in those days was we had 3 semesters. So you took your courses in about a 3-month period. And as a result, you never had to learn how to study because it was a very short learning period. So I loved the semester system, except when I got to university, I discovered I didn't really know how to study because I was used to these 3-month courses, not 6 or 8-month courses where you really had to carry the information forward. So it was a learning process. But I loved the opposite. I was pretty active in sports and basketball and delivering papers and all the usual things that kids did.
And aside, I can remember sports day at the junior high, and you beat me at all the running competitions. You know, you're right, Red Deer was unique in that respect, and I think all of us who went through the system certainly felt we benefited from it.
When we compare my life growing up compared to my kids' life growing up here in this house, our children were very security conscious, and we ended up in high school. We ended up taking our kids to school and picking them up, things like that. But in my time, and even Mary Jones' time, she's 10 years younger than I am, when she was growing up, actually in this house, the neighborhood was just wide open for kids. There were lots of kids. No one got concerned about who came or went. There were no security concerns. The appearance of a safe society was everywhere, unlike today. And there wasn't the level of violence or concern, the lack of civility and courtesy and respect for authority and all that we're experiencing today was not evident at all to us in those days.
No, very true. And the behavior of people was certainly different. Jim, after high school, you went on to the University of Alberta, and you decided to take law. Perhaps you'd tell us a bit about
Well, I took an arts
and then where you went.
Yeah, I took a degree, an arts degree in economics and history, and poli-sci was and I didn't know what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a teacher or I wanted to be a lawyer. I wasn't sure. And in those days, you had an appointment with the dean of each faculty, believe it or not. So I sat down with the Dean of Law, Wilbur Bunker, who I came to know quite well. I become the Attorney General within a number of years. Anyway, I sat down with Dean Bunker in the law school, and he gave me a test. He got the results, and he said, "Foster," he said, "you shouldn't be a lawyer. You should be a minister." These were his words. He thought I should be a minister of some kind. And I thought afterwards, by golly, I didn't like that advice, so I canceled my appointment with the Dean of Education and decided to take law school. And a number of years later, I am the first Minister of Advanced Education in the government as the MLA for Red Deer. I go back to open the new law school, and Dean Bunker is still there. And I reminded him that he told me years ago that I shouldn't be a lawyer, I should be a minister. I came to apologize because he was right. I was a better minister of the Crown than I was a lawyer.
That's a cute.
It's a cute story.
A cute double take. That law school was the one in Calgary.
The law school in Calgary, I resisted. I took my law at U of A. There wasn't a law school in Calgary. But when I was minister, the issue of the Calgary Law School came up, and I opposed it. But my premier, Peter Lougheed, decided that they wanted a law school in Calgary, so he was the boss.
Well,
They got to law school.
He was a lawyer too.
He was a lawyer too, yes.
Jim, when you graduated, as I recall, you were a member of the Gold Key Society too at the U of A, which was quite an honor. But after you graduated, where did you go with your degree?
I articled in Edmonton to the Matheson firm, and on the south side. I wanted to article in Edmonton because that's where all the major government facilities were, land titles, companies branch, etc. But I always knew I wanted to come back to Red Deer. That was my plan. So I spent a year in Edmonton articling there, and then I got admitted to the bar by Cam Kirby, who you know well, now gone, and came to Red Deer in '65. So I started in '65 with the firm, which previously had been known as Kirby, Murphy, Armstrong, Beams, the old Chapman Foster, the old McClure firm, and among other things, we were solicitors for the city of Red Deer and a bunch of other clients, so that got my interest going in municipal politics and provincial politics as well. Yeah.
Is there anything about your experience as an early lawyer in Red Deer that you recall that maybe reflected on the community, or was it just the kind of you were learning as you went?
Well, in the early days, in those days, this is 1965, and I practiced and I was elected to the House in '71. So in that interval of time, Red Deer had, I think, 22 lawyers in town. quite small. The number today is well over 100. Anyway, in those days, there were no computers. There were just simply typewriters and telephones. The lawyers got together at least once a month with a visiting judge coming to town. It was a highly social relationship with your peers. And the relationship was everything. I mean, a land titles deal would be done on 1 or 2 pages, not 20 or 30 pages. So it's a much more complex situation in the last number of years. It was a very collegial relationship with all the lawyers. We got to know all the lawyers in town, and because we worked with most of them. And the business in Red Deer in those days was very local. There weren't many companies or individuals who did much business elsewhere in the province, to say nothing of elsewhere in the country or beyond Canada. Latterly in my practice years, the technology had changed dramatically, of course. And clients, mine and others, were doing business all over Alberta, all over Canada, in some cases all over the world. So it was quite a different time. But the technology, the practice of law was by today's standards, was quite primitive. But the relationships were really strong, and I got to know everyone, and it was quite collegial. Today, with computers, lawyers really spend, they won't even bother going down the hall to talk to their colleagues. They'll simply do it virtually.
Send them a note.
Yes, and that had implications in the court system, which I got involved in later, yes.
Jim, perhaps you'd reflect a little bit on some of the contributions perhaps within the firm in law and outside that to the community by the members of your firm, which was quite
first of all,
firm.
Thanks, Bob. I came back to Red Deer. First of all, my mother was here, and my family were here, and I wanted to come back here. But I'd also known some of the lawyers here. I knew Cam Kirby. He had been my mother's lawyer. Frank Murphy, I'd known him. He had lived for a time across the street from where we grew up. So I had a relationship, and as I said, Cam Kirby admitted me to the bar. So when I joined the firm, it was Frank Murphy and Alan Armstrong and Jim Beams and Tom Chapman. Now Frank Murphy was a long-time member of the community, had been very active throughout the community. I think he had been chairman of the hospital board and a number of community activities. Alan Armstrong was a superb lawyer. I did a lot of work with him. He had a fabulous memory and was an excellent counsel. And Jim Beams turned out to be later my partner, probably the best lawyer I ever worked with, and I've worked with some pretty good lawyers. But Jim Beams was a city solicitor, and he was a golfing buddy as well. So they made me really feel at home. Tom Chapman, when in later years when Jim Beams moved to Edmonton and I went into politics, Tom Chapman and our firm carried on, and Tom became a city solicitor. But in the early days, Jim was a city solicitor and I was his assistant. Now, there were some difficulties in the office, and we later formed a different firm called Beams, Chapman, Foster, just the 3 of us, and John McAfee joined us later on. But all of these fellows I'd worked with, all men in those days, no women to speak of, acted in the practice at that time, unlike today, were very involved in the community. So you were expected to take part in the community and participate in the community and make a contribution through various activities, and I followed that route as well.
As we know and recall, Frank was, I think, a longstanding member of the Rotary Club, amongst other things.
And a bench of the Law Society for many years.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
You're reminding me of how close the community was, because they were all,
yes,
everybody knew everybody. And they mixed both, I guess, professionally, but certainly avocationally and through their hobbies and community interests. They got to know each other very well.
yes.
Well, I guess your next major change or step in the evolution of your career, Jim, was to enter politics. And perhaps you'd, tell us a bit about that. I mean, I know that Cam had been the head of the Conservative Party for Alberta before Peter Lougheed.
Yes.
And so your firm certainly was in some ways steeped in, I won't say steeped in politics.
Conservative politics.
Yes.
That's right. Well, I got involved in politics at university. And somehow or other I got involved in the Progressive Conservative Association. And I participated in model parliament. I participated in the UN. I established, with some others, the UN club at the U of A. as well as Lindsay Thurber way back
And some
when.
of your contemporaries went on to.
And we
major
participated in
political
model
firms.
parliament and all that kind of thing. Anyway, I got active in provincial politics. So when I came to Red Deer, I was interested in knowing what was happening. Bill Ure, who became a friend a lot, was an excellent social credit MLA for Red Deer. And Red Deer in those days, the constituency was both the city and a huge piece of the country. Innisfell and Delburn, for example, were included. So I got involved in politics, and believe it or not, Bob, I'm 27 years old, practicing law in Red Deer, and I run for the PC nomination. Believe it or not, I can't believe it. Anyway, in the 67 election, I won the city, but lost the country. And that's the good thing I did, because I didn't know enough about being not only a lawyer, much less an MLA. Anyway, I persevered, and in 71, when the firm was Beams, Chapman, Foster, and McAfee, I ran again and won. And I became the MLA for the sole MLA for the city of Red Deer, and I had established a relationship with a young guy called Peter Lougheed. He was 10 years older than me, who became premier, of course. But I got connected with Peter shortly after coming to Red Deer in 65. He became leader in the spring of that year. And so I worked with Peter between 65 and 67, and then up to 71 when I was elected. Coincidentally, I became the youngest cabinet minister in the Lougheed government in 71. I was the first minister of advanced education, as you know. And that was quite an interesting challenge, I must say. It was a brand new department which I created. And then in 75, at the age of 35, I became the Attorney General and Justice Minister, as you know, and that was an even more challenging portfolio. I went into politics with the view of serving only for 2 terms. I didn't want to become a career politician. I wanted to serve 2 terms, make my contribution, and come back to Red Deer, which is what I did. And those were very active, busy days when we were able to do so much for the city of Red Deer that needed so many things. It's quite a different time.
Do you want to elaborate in both of those portfolios about some of the Red Deer decisions that came up that you recall?
Well, in advanced ed, the thing that happened that was most startling and most difficult was Red Deer College blew up. People have forgotten this, but in 1972, a young student union president by the name of Jim Head led a revolt by the students in Red Deer College, and there was a student strike. It was serious. The place was being shut down.
Do you remember the issue?
Well, there were a combination of issues. It was a lack of leadership by the president, a board of governors that seemed a bit detached. There were, I won't call them troublemakers exactly, but there were some members of the faculty that were causing headaches. The fundamental issue, the war in the institution, believe it or not, and we've seen examples of this since, but nothing as serious. The war in the institution was a fight between those who wanted to maintain a college and those who wanted to become a university. It was an academic issue, and the students were fed up with all the wrangling among the staff. They were on strike, and since I'm the MLA, and now I'm the minister, this ball was in my court. So I spent an immense amount of time sorting all this out, meeting with everybody. In the end, we had to remove the president, we removed the board of governors, and I put in one of my senior staff, Dr. Ray Fast, who was one of my assistant deputy ministers. Ray ran RDC, Red Deer College, for about 18 months. Dr. Tim Byrne became the commissioner of a public inquiry. We ran an inquiry on Red Deer to discover the causes of all this. Red Deer College was the first college in Canada, new college, that suffered these kinds of stresses. And I think it was a release valve for a lot of other colleges in the country. Anyway, Red Deer got back on its feet with a new board of governors chaired by Bob Cooper and a new president with Bill Forbes. And Red Deer College has moved forward ever since, now Red Deer Polytechnic. That was a big challenge for me as minister. But there was all kinds of stuff that we were doing in and around central Alberta in those days. Red Deer needed so many things, but by far the most important decision we ever made, probably the most important piece of infrastructure after the railroad and the highway, was the Dixon Dam. And I initiated that with the Premier shortly after I was elected, and that's turned out to be a pretty important consideration.
Are there any others while you were Attorney General that?
Well, in the time I was there, the social credit guys had I think dropped the ball for many years, and we had a platform that was pretty extensive. So in Red Deer, we needed things like a new hospital. Those sound familiar? So we had to build a new hospital. We built a new courthouse. We built a new government center just on the other side of Ross Street, as you know, 51st. In those days, we established urban parks, so we did the Waskesiu Park system. We had to relocate the railroad from downtown Red Deer. We had to relocate the Westerner from downtown Red Deer. All of those institutions and initiatives were things we took in those days. Now, some of them didn't come to fruition until I was back in Red Deer practicing, but all of those initiatives were important and contributed to the city. Unfortunately, the city suffered mightily over the years with, as you know, the downtown today is a pale imitation of its former self.
Well, I guess from a.
On that, well, you asked me about the Justice Department. When we arrived in office in '71, Merv Leese was the Attorney General, and I worked closely with Merv. I didn't realize I was going to be the next one following him, but Merv worked mostly in energy, but he didn't get around to reforming the justice system in our first term. But he was smart enough with the Premier to appoint Cam Kirby, you may remember, as the head of a Royal Commission of Inquiry who looked into the justice system in Alberta. And Cam produced a series of 4 reports. The other members of it were Max Wyman, the president of the University of Alberta, and Ted Bauer, the editor of the Red Deer Advocate. So they were the commissioners who did the Kirby report. So when I arrived in January '75 as the new AG, 4 reports were sitting on my desk called the Kirby reports. So I had a mandate from the Premier to take the justice system, give it a great shake, and make huge changes. I am probably the only Attorney General in the history of this province who had unlimited funds, and unlimited resources, and unlimited approvals to do whatever was necessary to fix the system in the 4 years I was going to be AG. So I had to remake the department. I restructured the court system completely. I replaced almost every senior official in the Justice Department. We hired many new Crown attorneys, approved the construction of many new court facilities, including the existing Red Deer courthouse. It was a huge initiative, which I had to crank through in 4 years because I knew that I wouldn't be there longer than that. But while I was AG, I had a Royal Commission of Inquiry into RCMP misconduct, in those days, another one of those. But I did some other things that were important. One was the Matrimonial Property Act, which granted new property rights to women. And the other was to abolish the coroner system, as we know it, and you know all about the coroner system as a doctor. We created a medical examiner system called under the Fatality Inquiries Act. So there's some major initiatives. And
As I
quite fun.
recall, the head of that medical examiner investigation was Cam Kirby again. And he and John Butt were the 2 people involved in markedly changing the way in which
John became our first chief medical examiner. There were only 4 forensic pathologists in Canada at the time, and we had 2 of them in Alberta, so we were pretty fortunate.
It was certainly a major change, and I can remember the 2 of them presenting the changes that were coming to an audience in Calgary, and I was impressed that they got it through, and certainly a lot of the initiative was from John Butt, because that was a characteristic of his personality.
The Fatality Inquiries Act had been recommended by the Alberta Law Reform Institute, a think tank at the U of A, which I became a director of after I left politics and was on the court. I sat on that for a while as well. But the justice system in those days was showing was just simply completely run down. And if I fast forward today, and I spent 20 years, as you know, as a justice on the Court of Queen's Bench, and I'm the only person alive today with both that background and my political background as justice minister. And I can tell you, frankly, that the justice system in Alberta today is approaching the same level of tragedy that we had to face back then for many of the same reasons. Technology has changed, but the government has been starving the justice system, in my opinion, in this province for going on a couple of decades now, and we're seeing signs of it that are pretty appalling.
It's unfortunate that we aren't learning as much from our past as we should.
Right.
And which is, I guess, another reason for going through some of these reviews.
Well, part of the problem
People
is
like
that the
yourself
public don't,
raise the issues.
the public do not see the effects of the justice system. I mean, as individual citizens, we are experts in health and education because we went to school and we are involved with health issues on a daily basis. But most people have no real contact with the justice system. They don't see the problem. And MLAs, no one goes to their MLA and says, hey, build me a courthouse. They talk about schools and hospitals, and the public see that. But there's no swallow of public opinion when courthouses are too small. The Red Deer Courthouse has been too small for 25 years. It took the Tories did nothing until the NDP government came along and approved the new courthouse. Thank goodness it's being built just over the hill here as we speak. No thanks to my conservative community. The NDP did that, and good for them.
Well, you're right, the hospitals and hospital shortages or problems
Right.
get a lot more attention.
Yeah.
They've recently managed to get approval for a major addition to the Red Deer Hospital, which will cost a lot of money, but that's, the hospital's been able to go through incremental changes and improvements and enlargements over a long period of time.
Yeah.
Courthouse hasn't changed, there's only been 2 in the Red Deer.
And I'll give you a statistic. This sounds startling, but it's public information. Today, there are thousands of cases in the court system, thousands of cases in the court system that are subject to being dismissed for want of prosecution in a reasonable period of time. Now, that information I've been aware of, but that information was made public recently by the president of the Crown Attorneys Association. These are the Crown prosecutors, who are short-staffed, overworked, and simply can't keep up. And I would have thought there'd have been a huge public outcry, because these are arguably criminals who are walking the street today because of a failure of prosecution within a reasonable period of time. And that's simply because the government has not been providing the resources to do this. Moreover, the Attorney General of the day and previously has authorized the police no longer to relay a whole host of charges, nor are they prosecuting a whole number of charges in our society. And when those people aren't prosecuted, they're right back in the system creating more crime. This is the tragedy that we're into. This is 2022. It feels like the early 70s.
I think of some of the problems that you've described about drugs and how they're not getting addressed because the system isn't addressing anything. That's unfortunate. Jim, to continue, you came back to Red Deer and spent a number of years in practice, and then were appointed to the bench. Are there any experiences that you recall or you'd like to elaborate on during that period?
Well, when I started practicing law, Bob, as I said, we had the telephone and a typewriter. And after politics, I practiced in 91. I was appointed to the court, as you know, in 91. Latterly in my practice, we weren't quite into the computer age, but we had fax machines. And the clientele had certainly changed. Business people in Red Deer were doing business around the world, really, in the 90s and beyond, of course, and in the late 80s. But technology was coming. The technology that's changed has allowed the legal community, of course, to keep up as other professions have. But during that period of time, I found myself, to compare it with early days, I was acting for all kinds of groups and organizations, individuals, whose business activities carried them outside of Red Deer, outside of Alberta, often outside of Canada. And I ended up traveling to Asia, to Europe, to parts of the United States, farther in Canada, on these business interests. And having been in the government, I had a lot of people come to me who had government problems. So I was the guy to sort out issues with local clients and sometimes from more abroad with the Alberta government. Now, having been a justice minister, there was no way I was going to be in conflict with the government. I would not sue the government or be involved with litigation involving the government for obvious reasons. So I was restrained in that sense. But I had a very mixed practice, and it was quite stimulating and encouraging. And I had to marvel at, when I started practicing, Bob, the first word processing machine that came out in my early years was Olivetti made typewriters, as you recall. Mm-hmm. Olivetti came out with something called the Olivetti 401. And the first machine was a little disc that operated as a word processor. You could put 3 pages of information on this little disc. These machines cost $8,100 a piece. A few years later, you could equip a secretarial station with the computer and all of that capacity for about $1,000. The difference in cost of practicing law and the technology, the difference in productivity of staff and lawyers was just astounding. And it continues every day.
Yeah, there's so much more we can do, or just
There's
recall with a press of a button.
That's right. But the thing that I think has suffered is that technology allows lawyers to sit in their offices and deal with the world. And even now I see lawyers are saying, given COVID and the experience of doing so much on a computerized CCTV basis, they now want to conduct all kinds of legal court proceedings sitting in their offices as opposed to coming to a courthouse and running trials there. So it's kind of a virtual process. As a trial judge, that to me is very difficult because, as we know, communication isn't just what I say. There's a certain body language that is important in making your point. And if you don't have the real person in front of you, you miss something in communication. So lawyers are sitting in their offices today hoping to do business from their office. As I say, sometimes simply communicating with their colleagues down the hall on a computer tap rather than walking next door and talking to them. So the human experience of decision making, and a court system is simply dispute resolution in a wide variety of fields, of course, but dispute resolution requires the trier of fact, i.e. the judge, to do an evaluation of the evidence and make findings of fact. That's enhanced greatly by having real people in a real live context as opposed to simply watching television screens. It's going to be difficult in the future.
Yes, there's pluses and minuses. I think of the changes in medicine that have occurred, and quite frankly, they're for the benefit because we can now do a lot more interviewing and problem assessments through Zoom, and at least seeing a person on the other side, even though you're not directly talking to them. So it's had different impacts on different professions.
Well, I've, as you know, I've done a fair bit of public speaking over the years in various capacities, and I love a live audience. Now, I've tried speaking to groups on Zoom. I spoke to a group of men in Red Deer not too long ago who asked me to speak to them about some justice issues, and I did this on Zoom, and it was a cold, impossible environment. I cannot feel the audience, I cannot see the audience, I don't get any feedback from the audience, and I'm not into the Zoom business. In terms of, it's great to have groups I meet with groups of guys on Zoom to talk about issues, but if you want to address a group, in live presentations are, to me, far more effective than electronic.
Yeah, you're right. It has different influences or impacts, and there's certain things you can do, and there are others that you can't do well.
Right.
Jim, your avocational life in Red Deer, you're back in the community, and you've contributed significantly, not just professionally, but avocationally. And would you like to perhaps share a few?
Well, when I came back to Red Deer, I joined the Navy at university, as you know, and trained with them, and they helped put me through most of my post-secondary education. So when I came back, and I was a I was a officer at HMCS Nonsuch, a reserve officer in HMCS Nonsuch, Edmonton, and I retired from there. But when I came back to Red Deer, I got involved with the Navy League, so I became the the CEO, wearing my Navy uniform of the Navy League boys. I think they were 9 to 12. I forget the age group, but the young boys.
Cadets,
I did that.
yeah.
Cadets. They did that. So I did that for a few years. I got involved in the Kinsman Club. I got involved in the K40 Club. I got involved in the Sailing Club. I did all sorts of things like that. Later years, I got involved with, as I said, the Law Reform Institute at the University of Alberta. Pat O'Callaghan was at one time was the publisher of the Red Deer Advocate. He became the publisher of the Edmonton Journal. And after I left politics, Pat said to me, we'd like you to become the chairman of the Alberta Press Council, hearing complaints against the printed press in Alberta. And I said, Pat, why are you picking on me? And he said, because nobody would ever accuse you of being a handmaiden to the press, because I had lots of issues as Attorney General, of course, and I was in constant bourrahah with the press. And so I became chair of the Alberta Press Council. This was a kind of a volunteer, paid honorary thing, and we probably run half a dozen hearings a year. This was all outside the practice of law. And of course, I've been an active Alberta PCer and a federal PCer in federal and provincial politics, except for the time I was on the court, of course. That was 20 years. I had to stay away from political activity. I could be a member, but I couldn't be active in politics.
You were involved in the Joe Clark campaign.
We ran the Joe Clark campaign. I was in '76. I was Justice Minister, and I was the only cabinet minister level in Canada that was back in Joe at the time. So we ran Joe Clark's campaign out of our office in Edmonton. We went to the bank and raised a bunch of money. All kinds of people signed a note, and we got Joe going. And that was all history. Great fun. I don't know I have the courage to do that today, but it was an important time, and
Well, it was successful too.
it was successful. That's right. Many of us were involved, but that's where I met a lot of people I knew. Yeah, it's true.
Those, I think back to those university days, they were exciting because we had people like Jimmy Coots and Preston Manning.
And Grant Notley.
Grant, you're right.
And Grant
Notley.
Notley, Lou Hyman and Brother Peter, and people like that. And I spoke to the Premier when she was down here, when she came to announce the opening of the courthouse. And I told her that I had known her dad at university. We participated in model parliament together and debated. And that Grant entered the legislature at the same time I did. And Grant was a staunch, hard left-winger, unlike Rachel Notley. Rachel is a central left politician. She's not hard like her dad. And the way things are going around here at the moment, may I offer the comment that I think Rachel will be our next premier.
Well, unless there's a major change politically, that's certainly a possibility. I can remember Grant Notley, who was in residence at the time, and the one thing I really remember about him is don't get into a corner where he's standing looking at you in the corner because you'll never get out. Jim, you were also involved in the Rotary club for a long time, and one of the projects you got involved in was the Career Opportunity Fund.
You've got a good memory. Good for you. Yes, I was asked to chair that. This was a committee to come up with a project for the 75th anniversary of Rotary in Red Deer, and we're now approaching our 100th anniversary. Anyway, our committee looked at a variety of considerations, and the thing that motivated our original final decision was I thought about when I was in school, all the young boys and girls who weren't academically outstanding but were academically solid, but who had a great financial need and could not afford to go on to post-secondary education. So we came up with a plan to fund something we call the Career Opportunity Fund. It's not a scholarship, as you know. It is an opportunity fund. So the criteria are, this is open to all high school students in Red Deer. You have to have acceptable marks for purposes of going on to a post-secondary schooling experience anywhere in Alberta. You have to show demonstrated contribution to the community. and we give you various marks for various activities. Anyway, we have about 20 kids every year, and we're now giving them, I think it's $2,000 a year, and we make this award every year. The Rotary Club has put almost $1 million into this trust fund with the Community Foundation, and that's the basis of the funding for this program. And tonight, as a matter of fact, we're having a meeting to select the candidates for this year. I have been on this committee, continue to be on this committee since we started it nearly 25 years ago. So I was the chair of the committee, but the committee came up with this Career Opportunity Fund. I think it's the best thing that Rotary does. And I was disappointed that the focus seems to have shifted elsewhere in terms of Rotary funding. We still managed to squeak a few dollars out of the treasury for the funding to make up enough funds to support our 20 kids, but we've gone from $1,000 to $2,000 a year. It's not a lot of money, but it does act as an incentive to get these kids going, and they can go to any post-secondary schooling opportunity in Alberta. And we've had many people come back to us and say that it was a really important initiative to get them started. And I'm very proud to be part of that, and still am.
Well, it has turned into the largest project, at least financially, of the club, and has almost $1 million behind it now.
Yeah.
And I think has given out well over $500,000 in scholarships. Certainly watching the number of students who come up and introduce themselves at the Rotary meeting where they're acknowledged, you can see how important it is to each and all of them, especially if they stay in Red Deer and can live at home and go to the college.
That's right.
It's really made a big difference to a lot of people.
Yes.
And it's a carry-on of the certainly the longest standing project the club has had with the awards that it started giving to the top students back in the 1950s at the initiative of Harold Daw.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a major step forward when we established that fund. Now, Jim, are there any other things that you want to comment on about living in Red Deer and raising a family in Red Deer and having been such an integral part of it for so many years?
Well, I'm, as I say, as you know, I grew up here, so I have all of that wonderful experience, and I wanted to live here, and I have, and we bought the family home of my wife's family, Mary Jo Cornett, who you know, and we live here on the edge of Michener Hill overlooking the city, so it's been a lovely environment. My kids have grown up in this house. I've got 2 children, they're both in Edmonton. One's a lawyer, and one is a nursing psychologist working with young people. Raising a family in Red Deer has just been, to me, a joy. As it probably wouldn't be anywhere, but it's my kids' life here was in some respects a little less secure than mine, because in those days, as you know, Red Deer was a much safer place to be than it is at the moment. I had opportunities to go to Edmonton and Calgary, both with the court and in the law practice, but my focus has always been in Red Deer. It's been a beautiful life in so many ways. I'm still active in the community in the sense that I take an interest in what's going on politically, both municipally and provincially and federally, and in all senses. I am keenly disappointed in how the city has developed, especially the downtown. I am a part owner of a major office building in the downtown, and I can tell you that the rents today in downtown Red Deer are a fraction of what they were 30 years ago. And you know about offices in downtown Red Deer and the downtown. You've experienced in that regard as well. The city of Red Deer over the years, we worked so hard to make things solid for the downtown, but the city of Red Deer have made some very unfortunate decisions and choices in the last few decades, frankly, certainly 20 years, when the downtown is now under huge stress for decisions taken by City Hall. They've, if I can comment on that, they've They filled the downtown with street people, and they allowed the county of Red Deer to build a whole new city on our south boundary. And the downtown today is desperate. It won't recover for years to come. And one of these days, the tax revenue from downtown will just sink, and the rest of us will be paying for it, and the public need to know that. It's just disappointing that an absence of foresight and good leadership in City Hall has caused this mess. And this is 2022. When people watch this show in some years from now, they can judge whether things changed all that for the better. But things right in downtown today are in pretty sad shape, I'm sorry to say, and not much on the horizon.
No, we certainly from a personal experience
Yes.
have been acutely aware of that, and it's changed a number of our family decisions as well.
Right.
Using the criteria, is this a building you would want 25 years from now? If the answer is no, sell it.
Yeah.
Um,
The attitude, when these problems developed, the city's response seemed to be, well, let's put flags and benches and flower pots and lights all over downtown Red Deer, and that will somehow make it more amenable and more appealable. That's no substitute for people being accosted on the street by street people. We've lost 4 major banks, we've lost 3 major accounting firms, we've lost all kinds of businesses, and this is a direct result of some very bad decisions made over time. And even as we speak this week, we're going to hear what the city's going to do about some of these downtown facilities that are being designed for street people, and if they don't make the right call, we're headed further down the road.
It's not as promising a note as I'd like to end
We-
this chat on, but
That's right. But it's,
for those of us who go back to when...
for those of us who go back long enough,
2500.
we have seen the evolution of this community come from, I mean, everything was beautiful in the downtown. Now, we developed 2 shopping centers north and south. Businesses moved out. We now have office buildings strung all over the area. Red Deer hasn't given much priority to its downtown. Every municipality seems to have to learn this lesson, large or small, but we've got to come to grips with it. But Red Deer as a community is still a beautiful community to live in, to raise children in. Compare this with most other centers anywhere you want to go, and my first choice would still be living here, of course.
It's for some of the decisions are made by I won't say our predecessors, but certainly our contemporaries to develop the river system and the road and the path system and preserve what we remember as
Right.
Red Deer has certainly been wanting now. And as I look around the world, and as we travel around it and look at cities our size, and we find them dramatically different than Red Deer, which is unfortunate, but it does present a challenge. I guess we can end on the note that when Edmonton undertook that and developed its central core, it had an amazing impact. I think it was called the Web and Map or something, redesigned for downtown Edmonton. What a material impact it had. Needs some kind of visioning like that for Red Deer.
Well, the thing that struck me about Edmonton, and I spent a lot of my life in Edmonton, as you know. Actually, I was actually born in Edmonton. My mother had me in Edmonton because her family were there, and I don't think she wanted to have me born in Minelto at the time. Anyway, having spent time in Edmonton and knowing Edmonton quite well, the Edmonton authorities have focused on developing the downtown core, as you say, with more and more people. And there's thousands and thousands more people living in the downtown core, which is, of course, is establishing the core of the city. Calgary is going through the same difficulty. Red Deer will probably do the same thing, but we've got to put more people in the downtown who actually live there to, I think, ameliorate this problem going forward. And I think we will, but it's going to take a long time.
Well, it'll take people with vision,
Vision
fortitude,
and
determination.
financing. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's Red Deer in the future, and we can look forward to the people who go over some of these interviews and judge us accordingly on what we saw, what we've perhaps accomplished in a collective sense, and where Red Deer with a bit of
It's the old,
foresight, we'll go.
it's the old story, Bob. You need to understand your history. You need to understand where you've been to understand where you're going. And that's the value of history, as you know. And if you have people running your government, for example, who don't know the history of certain issues and problems, they make the same mistakes again and again. I keep seeing this in provincial politics because we have a perspective that goes back a long way. We made those mistakes many years ago. Let's not do that again, but we make the same mistakes. So all I can hope for is that we get men and women in public office who will take the time to understand the history of their community and the history of their institutions as they grapple with problems of the future. The problems don't go away. There are many of the same problems. They need to understand your history, because if you don't know where you've been, you don't understand where you're going. And hopefully this program of yours, and thanks to those who do this, will give people some perspective on the past and the difficulties and the problems and where we're going in the future. So congratulations and thanks.
Well, it's been a pleasure to share some of our similar and then diverging, I guess, as we got older experiences, Jim, and I thank you very much
Thanks,
for
Bob.
allowing me the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. You're welcome.